In the last video, number 21, the title of section 4.2 was Knowing as Having Belief, Truth, and Evidence. And of course, that's referring to the traditional threefold definition of knowledge as justified true belief. But the focus of that section was on truth and belief, and the discussion of evidence or justification is reserved for the section we'll talk about today. So really, you should scratch out the "and evidence" as being part of the title of 4.2. Okay, so then he comes to kind of the punchline section, which is called "The Unbeliever Knows God Without Confessing It." And here it's to drive home that we know from Scripture, Romans 1 in particular, that all men know God at one level. And not just a God or a divinity, but the God, ton theon, the true, living and true God. And so this is an important foundation for the apologetic, because in a sense you could almost say that the apologetic is more trying to make the unbeliever see what he already knows or recognize what he already knows through oblique argumentation. And so that's going to be the key foundation for the Van Tillian apologetic. On page 180, he says, "In the end, the work of the apologist is not simply an intellectual mission akin to a scientist trying to convince colleagues about his new research conclusions, but embodies as well the work of morally convicting the non-Christian for not coming up to the truth that he already knows and cannot escape. The non-Christian has definite beliefs about God that are true, and he possesses full and overwhelming warrant for those beliefs." Skipping a few lines, "Our knowledge of God is not just like the rest of our knowledge. The psalmist wrote, 'In thy light we see light,' Psalm 36:9. The knowledge that all men have of God because of natural revelation provides the framework or foundation for any other knowledge they are able to attain. The knowledge of God is the necessary context for learning anything else. One can gain enlightenment, see light, about the world or oneself only in terms of the more fundamental revelation of God about himself, in thy light." And this is the key insight that we dwelt on at length in the previous video of describing in what way it is that the transcendental presence of God is the foundation for the knowing project, whether looked at inductively or deductively, and how that's how our claim is that this is a provable and necessary connection. So again, the type of the knowledge that is being focused on here, the knowledge of God, is not just like any other kind of knowledge, but it's foundational knowledge. It's that upon which all other knowledge rests. Page 182, the end of this section. "When men deny having this knowledge, their thinking and attempts to gain knowledge can be reduced to absurdity. This biblical insight is at the heart of Van Til's presuppositional defense of the faith." So the next section within 4.3, Bahnsen gives the title, "The Character of the Unavoidable Evidence for God." And here he's going to dig in to what he calls immediate judgment or immediate knowledge, immediate justification, as opposed to inferential. In other words, as opposed to where the justification for a belief is the result of premises stacked logically. So he says, we do so i.e., we make this claim because of a common but simplistic and thus misleading tendency to make inferential or discursive knowledge the model for all cases of knowing. So then he talks about how this imaginary figure, Sam, has the belief that milk causes indigestion for him, and how that was based on numerous experiences in the past where milk always gave him indigestion. And he's drawn the inductive conclusion that this is a connection that is formulated as a belief, namely that milk causes indigestion, at least for me. And even though this is inductive, this would be an example of an inferential belief. He gives several other examples. But then he qualifies such inferential or discursive knowledge as common, but that does not mean that knowledge arises only from such reasoning. There are obvious cases of non-inferential knowledge. It is implausible and artificial to insist that they must somehow be the product of an unconscious inference. Top of page 183. Surely there are times when one believes certain propositions with good reason, without inferring them from other propositions, as when one believes that one is typing with both hands, or believes that the music is painfully loud, or believes that one is not the same person as one's neighbor, or believes the times tables in math. So now these are examples that I think can be challenged as to his thesis that they are immediate judgments. So, for example, when he says one is typing with both hands, that's a belief that's immediate. But I guess what I would say instead of that is that we have formed this network of beliefs about having hands, using them instrumentally, what it means to type. I guess I would even appeal to the categories we discussed in the last video of implication. There's a lot of implications to the notion of typing with both hands that go out to the whole world, just like that wood carving example I used last time. And then they become habituated. A lot of those insights become habituated from time, from say, a very early age. And so I grant that the belief that Bahnsen is claiming is not inferential, that I'm typing with both hands, is virtually instantaneous, temporally. But it does seem to me like it has baked into it structure. Let's call it structure. Whether you want to call that inferential structure is perhaps what the question is. But similarly, I believe that the music is painfully loud. I guess a better example for me would be that I'm experiencing pain. Perhaps would be an immediate judgment. That the music is causing that pain seems to me, again, to bring in some connections and associations that perhaps are made very quickly based on habit, but I'm not sure that that we can say it's without any inference whatsoever. Okay, stop. I think we can skip the Bahnsen material as far as like going through it line by line. Realize that it's not essential to the flow of the argument here, which way you fall on that question. I don't think. And so Bahnsen's section is worth reading, and of course you should read it. And he discusses, the justification part of justified true belief. And in addition to explaining what it means, gives the typical nuance of the fact that one could be mistaken, or one might not be able to articulate the justification, and so forth. all of the semantic complexity that goes into any of such notion. Um, and then as far as the distinction between natural revelation and natural theology, we'll be getting to that in the section, the readings of Van Til anyhow, so there's no need to dwell a lot on that either. So anyway, having said all that, let's jump right into the Van Til reading, which starts at the bottom of page 186. And Bahnsen gives this section the title, Even Professing Atheists Clearly Know That God Exists. And if you look at the footnote, you'll see the references to the Van Tilian corpus. And I wanted to point out that the B section from the Defense of the Faith, those page numbers are from an edition that I don't have. I have the third edition, which looks like this. And in the third edition, you should replace the page numbers with 97 to 98, 137, 152, 195 and following. And the last paragraph in this reading I couldn't find at all, anywhere. Then for the C reading, Common Grace, I can't find my edition of Common Grace, so I'm not able to double check those paginations. The A section, Introduction to Systematic Theology, looks correct. So what we have here is a sequence of triplets, and I'm going to call them the dialectical explication of the man's apprehension of God. So this is Van Til attempting to kind of unpack and show the structure of that which we know from the Psalms and from Romans chapter 1 to be the case, namely that the natural man does in fact receive the revelation from God and knows God. And so what Van Til is doing is trying to show what that is. And he gives a number of different attempts at them. And each of them has an interesting kind of dialectical structure in my mind. And this is the aspect of the Van Tilian exposition that I feel like we should continue to develop. It's sort of a phenomenological unpacking of the dialectic. You can see again why people have wondered if there's connections with Hegelianism with Van Til. And of course, we've talked about this before, how that isn't the case, but yet there's some analogies of method. And so this is something I would commend again to the young students that, looking for a thesis topic or something to develop. This type of reflection, I feel, would lend itself fruitfully to further study. So Van Til, section A. We shall not attempt to give an exegesis of this most difficult passage, Romans 1. It may suffice to call attention to the following matters. In the first place, we observe that Paul says that men do actually, in some sense, see the truth. We do not do justice to this passage by merely saying that all men or most men believe in a God, small g, or believe that God, capital G, probably exists. Paul says that the revelation of the only existing God is so clearly imprinted upon man himself and upon his environment that no matter how hard he tries, he cannot suppress this fact. As psychologically active, self-conscious creatures, they must see something of the truth. They hold down the truth, to be sure, but it is the truth that they hold down. Nor is it that this truth is objectively placed before them only in nature and in the makeup of man. It is, to be sure, on this that Paul does lay the emphasis, but knowledge is also in man in the sense that his subjective reaction to that which he sees shows some acquaintance with the truth. The invisible things of God are perceived, kathoratai. Knowing God, gnontes ton theon, they have not glorified God. And so here we see the first attempt at describing the dialectic of nature, man himself, and then the reflection upon that duality. So man looks out at the object and sees God, which is really God revealing himself to man. And man is able to reflect on himself given that substrate of God's presence and God's encounter of him as a person to person. Then man is able to, as it were in a mirror, see his own activity. And then moreover, he's able to synthesize this into an evaluation by which he finds himself coming short, or as Paul says, excusing and accusing. So certainly in the ethical aspect, this third stage of the dialectic is very manifest. We all feel it within ourselves. The nightmares, the twisting and turning, thinking about the past. But as Van Til will show as we continue, it's not just these ethical types of evaluations, but even just systematic, truth-sensitive evaluation. Continuing. In the second place, so in the first place, it was said that Paul says that men actually, in some sense, see the truth. In the second place is the evaluation that men make in response to that first stage of knowing the truth in the sense of their self-evaluation. Van Til says, in the second place, it is primarily in this fact that men know and do not live up to what they know that Paul sees the greatest folly. Though they knew God, yet they glorified him not. They hold down the truth that is in them as well as round about them. It is this immediate connection that Paul speaks of the revelation of God's wrath. He says that God's wrath is displayed on men just because they hold down the truth in unrighteousness. And so that kind of adds yet another layer dialectically where the self-evaluation of this connection between God's revelation of himself and man's ability to look at himself then expands out yet another layer to be aware of God's wrath. And at first I was found this a bit off-putting as a philosopher and perhaps as a sinner, that we should bring up God's wrath in this connection when we're trying to unpack knowledge per se. What does God's wrath and the threat of judgment have to do with that? Except that when we look at the Areopagus sermon in Acts 17, Paul in fact does end his sermon with a reminder of the judgment to come. After having looked for points of contact, so to speak, with the Greek's own mind, God is near unto us and so forth, he ends by discussing the person of Christ and the redemption and the judgment to come. And it's also interesting that the creeds, even the short Apostles' Creed, ends with the judgment. So it begins with creation and goes to the judgment. So the creed itself builds in the entire history of man from creation to judgment. And so this is a theme that should be brought out. If you recall our discussion of his pamphlet, I believe in video number 15, of the pamphlet, Why I Believe in God, Van Til mentions this theme of judgment very gently, like near the beginning, and perhaps again toward the end, to kind of frame the discussion and kind of give it some liveliness. And it does, usually connect. In fact, I made a comment on X recently about a rock singer that was talking about how she had decided to have an abortion early in her career, and that was the thing that made it possible for her to have this great success, in the rock and roll world. And she was kind of like almost boasting about it. And I just made a comment that, isn't this typical of baby boomers that as they reflect on their life, as they're starting their last lap around the track, they still show no sense of reflection on the coming judgment of God. Well, you should have seen, like, all of a sudden, like a dozen people or 20 people out of the woodwork responding, like, what are you talking about the judgment? How do you know about there's such a thing as a judgment? There's no such thing as a judgment. We're all fine. Like, it really made people very angry. And, if you take a bird's eye view, it's like, if you really didn't believe it or feel it, you wouldn't be this angry about it. You would just like roll your eyes heavenward and like, there these fundamentalists go again, when will they stop? But no, it really is a visceral type of thing. So I've changed my view that even though this is a philosophy book, this is a crucial aspect. Continuing. As far as the intellectual aspect of the matter is concerned, we have now the following factors. In the first place, the body of man is, since the entrance of sin, in a weakened condition. In the second place, the functions of the soul are weakened. In the third place, and in spite of this, the invisible things of God, that is, the nature of God, his power and divinity, are still displayed in man as well as round about him, in the fact of the self-conscious activity of his person, in his own negative moral reaction to the revelation about and within him, in his sense of dissatisfaction with all non-theistic interpretations, and in a measure of involuntary recognition of the truth of the theistic interpretation as the true interpretation of the origin of the world. So notice these things he lists. Van Til is claiming that the natural man, all of us, sense our own debilitation in body and soul. So we know that we're on the way to dying. Our bodies are failing. We know that the powers of our soul are also weakened. We get bored, we get distracted, we get lazy, we procrastinate. And that in spite of this weakened condition of body and soul, we see the bright, shining glory of God when we go out to look at the night sky and see the stars imposing themselves upon us. There's almost an immediate awe, us being struck by awe, so that we're the weak ones and God is the strong one. And then man's evaluation, Van Til ticks off several. His own negative moral reaction to the revelation about and within him. The sense of dissatisfaction with non-theistic interpretations. Footnote 65. Bahnsen says, the epistemological issue that the Christian apologist makes explicit is that the unbelieving worldviews are not satisfactory from an intellectual standpoint, primarily because they cannot make knowing intelligible in terms of the very worldviews which are posed. And then thirdly, in a measure, in involuntary recognition of the truth of the theistic interpretation. And I think he means by this that when presented with a coherent theist and hence theistic interpretation of this phenomenon that we're talking about, he reluctantly has to agree with it. In spite of all this, man has not accepted for himself what he himself must admit to be the true interpretation of the origin of the world. Continuing on page 188. In this respect, man's knowledge is characterized by the same folly that marks Satan's knowledge of God. The first act of man's antitheistic interpretation consisted in the attempt on his part to be something that he knew he could not be. It is this folly that man has carried on through the ages, and it is this that still makes sin so foolish. And it is upon this foolishness that Paul says the wrath of God is revealed. Now he'll go into the second phenomenology of the dialectic, second paragraph on page 188. This revelation is A, partly objective to man in the narrow sense of being outside his person, as is the case with revelation in nature. B, partly subjective to man in the narrow sense of consisting of his psychological constitution. So again, the nature, his own constitution. C, partly subjective in the sense of consisting of his own involuntary ethical approval or disapproval, conscience. Now, one thing I noticed was that there's a parallel passage in the Defense of the Faith. What I just read comes from Introduction to Systematic Theology. But the parallel passage in Defense of the Faith, instead of putting thirdly the partly subjective, he says it's identified as objective. And that was interesting, that there's some confusion between whether we should identify this third aspect of the evaluation as subjective or objective. But I think that's exactly what I'm trying to get at here, is the dialectic continues to kind of reverse back and forth in this mirror image, or dialogue, you might say, where it takes up both the subjective and the objective. And therefore, Van Til can try to describe this phenomenologically as either subjective or objective, depending on what the emphasis is at that moment. Over against that which is thus objective, parenthesis 1, outside man, 2, within man, psychologically, 3, within man as involuntary ethical relation. And notice that already here he's re-identifying the third piece as objective, where he had just called it subjective. We call that subjective, which gives expression self-consciously, even if not with full consistency, to what that sinner does with that which comes to him objectively. As sinner, he seeks to suppress the objective revelation of God within him. Next, he's going to evaluate this same threefold dialectic from the perspective of history, from the creation, fall, redemption motif of Scripture, with man as an historical being, as opposed to the kind of timeless analysis of this first dialectic. So he continues. We can readily see that all these matters taken together produce a very complex situation. There are three main things to be taken into consideration. In the first place, we must think of what was the original situation in paradise and what remained of this after the fall of man. So creation and then fall kind of lumped in together, creation and what is remaining after the fall. In the second place, we must think of the wrath of God and the great complexity that this introduced into the situation. In the third place, we must think of non-saving grace, and especially of the great civilization that has flourished by it as a means. And so here Van Til is mentioning common grace, his view of common grace as governing history after the fall to the present, in common between the redeemed and the unredeemed. And this is important not only to try to account for the fact that man is able to accomplish great things despite his rebellion, but it also is a kind of hint as man ponders that the wrath of God continues to be delayed. Like when he sins, the thunder and lightning don't come down from heaven and destroy him, which kind of gives him boldness in his sin. But the intellectual substrate of realizing that this has to be a gracious posture of God sort of points toward the need for salvation, the possibility of salvation. Even though he doesn't have the full knowledge to allow him to embrace Christ, he is surrounded by a type of grace. So now he'll unpack this threefold historical dialectic with a little more detail. Under the first head, we have the fact that man's rationality is, as a matter of fact, a creation of God. When man tries to make of himself an ultimate instead of approximate starting point in knowledge, he somehow feels that he is doing something that he cannot do and that he ought not to try to do. Under the second head, we have the fact that man's mind is, as a matter of fact, now that sin has entered into it, abnormal. When man acts as though his mind were normal, he frustrates himself, and he senses something of this self-frustration. He somehow feels that his ideal of absolute comprehension in knowledge is a false ideal. Under the third head, we have the fact that, in spite of the fact that man has tried to set himself up as a metaphysically ultimate starting point, and in spite of the fact that he considers his mind to be normal, he has been able to do as much as he has. He ought to recognize the fact, says Calvin, that he lives by grace. The highest point of revelation outside of Scripture, as it is found after the entrance of sin, is just this point, that, together with the objective clarity of all these matters, comes the fact that men, in some sense, at bottom recognize them to be true. The truth, as it were, penetrates into men's minds against their will and in spite of themselves. Okay, now we come to the B reading. Everything we talked about up till now has been the readings marked A. Now we come to B. And now I'm going to read less exhaustively and just try to pick out highlights, because I think with the exposition that I've given, the rest of these sections fall into place fairly easily, except that they do raise a couple of interesting additional points, so I'm just going to focus in on those. So he says, page 189, the Reformed apologist would compromise what he holds to be of the essence if he agreed with Taylor. Taylor is a guy that he, in the original text, had discussed, so we don't need to get distracted by what Taylor said. But here's the point. For him, the Reformed apologist, the whole of created reality, including therefore the fields of research with which the various sciences deal, reveals the same God of which Scripture speaks. So here the thesis is that the God that encounters man in his natural state of nature is not just some generic approximation, but is the God, the only God, the living and true God. The very essence of created reality is its revelational character. Scientists deal with that which has the imprint of God's face upon it. Skipping a few lines. Following Paul's example, Calvin argues that men ought to see God, capital G, not a God, small g, not some supernatural power, but the only God in nature. They have not done justice by the facts they see displayed before and within them if they say that a God exists or that God, capital G, probably exists. The Calvinist holds to the essential perspicuity of natural as well as biblical revelation. And so here, this is a challenging point, because obviously man responding to natural revelation is not going to be writing Hodge's 3-volume systematic theology. Like, there's a lot of information and data missing from the natural revelation. And to the extent that he describes God as glorious or omnipotent or the judge of all men, is he picking out the living and true God, or is he picking out something that's more like the generic, like something shared with generic gods? So in other words, I guess what we have here is the principle of identity, the identity criterion for speaking of God. For example, can man in his natural state respond to this revelation in a way of proper worship that would be pleasing to God? And it seems to me the answer to that is that no, he can't do that without additional revelation. And yet we also can recognize that it leaves him without excuse. And so I think what we have to say here is that there's a mystery involved. Like there's a mystery of understanding how it is that man encounters the living and true God, and yet in a limited way that are dealing with a subset of his will and his attributes. I think we have to say with Van Til that yes, it is the living and true God that it encounters. It has to be, otherwise it would just be a fantasy or a figment of his imagination. But that it's not clear. We're not going to be able to untangle precisely where that knowledge ends and man's fantasy and counterfeit substitutions begin. There's going to be a fuzzy boundary in there that's impossible to unravel in the case of any particular man. But it still should give us confidence in explaining these things to the natural man, that his premonition, if he wants to say of the numinous or something, is in fact of the living and true God. And now we want to show him, I'm here to tell you more about the living and true God, that you might worship him in spirit and in truth. And then the discussion goes from there. I'm going to skip the contrast that he makes with the Roman Catholic theology. I don't think it necessarily contributes here. Going down to the middle of page 190. Thus the knowledge of God is inherent in man. It is there by virtue of his creation in the image of God. So again, the creation starting. This may be called innate knowledge, but as such it must be distinguished from the innate ideas of idealist philosophy. For the innate knowledge, as Calvin thinks of it, is based upon the idea of man's creation in the image of God. As such, it is correlative to the idea of revelation to man, mediated through the facts of his environment, which are also created by God. In contrast with this, the innate knowledge of Descartes and idealist philosophy is based on the idea of the autonomy of man. So always going back to God the Creator and man, the imago Dei, who knows God because he's made for that very purpose, as opposed to the autonomous speculations of philosophers that come up with their own ideas of innate ideas. God witnessed to them through every fact of the universe from the beginning of time. No rational creature can escape this witness. It is the witness of the triune God, whose face is before men everywhere and at all time. Even the lost in the hereafter cannot escape the revelation of God. This I thought was a striking statement, because evangelicals often describe hell as the place where God is absent, where man gets his wish of not being interfered with by God anymore. But Van Til, I think, correctly points out that actually God is present in hell. Has to be, continuing to reveal himself. Otherwise, he wouldn't be omnipresent. God made man a rational, moral creature. He will always be that. As such, he is confronted with God. He is addressed by God. He exists in the relationship of covenant interaction. He is a covenant being. To not know God, man would have to destroy himself. And then the skipping some of the recapitulation of this B section. Then the C section looks to me like another recapitulation of the same material. Here he introduces the analogy of the radio. And the thought is that think of man like trying to tune to a radio station where the voice of God is not heard, but no matter where he tunes, it's almost like a Twilight Zone episode. No matter where he tunes, it's the same voice coming at him inexorably. No matter which button of the radio he presses, he always hears the voice of God. Footnote 70. Bahnsen. In his intellectual endeavors, there is no subject, or radio station, that a man can choose to consider, button he presses, which does not bring him to the revelation of God. He cannot escape being confronted by God if he is self-conscious at all. And finally, we come to the section that Bahnsen entitles Natural Revelation Distinguished from Natural Theology. And again, I don't think it's necessary to plow through this line by line. it's making the point that all of this, all of these features of God's revelation that have been discussed in the chapter up till now, the model that should be thought of is the sunshine coming from God to man, and then how he responds and reflects back on it and so forth. But it's revelation of God whereby he shows himself. And he contrasts this to natural theology, and by his terminology, natural theology is man's attempt to describe or put into his own words his reaction to this natural revelation. So natural revelation is going in this direction. Natural theology is going in this direction. And of course, Van Til is going to say that the effort at natural theology is basically going to be a failure, because man's effort to recapitulate the revelation into his own words and concepts is inevitably going to be tainted by his natural rebellion, his unwillingness to actually face up to the living and true God. So natural theology is always going to be defective. So this will need to be discussed perhaps further when we discuss even the Reformed and Lutheran theologians. In the 19th century, they inevitably had a prolegomena section which would talk about methods shared in common with other intellectual activities, and deduce as much as possible about the divine attributes. And Van Til is going to say that all of those efforts are for naught. We need to always be correcting our reasoning with Scripture. If you have Scripture, why would you fall back to something subscriptural? So again, using Calvin's analogy of Scripture as the spectacles. The natural revelation is clear as such. In other words, the fault is not with the revelation, but the fault is with how we tend to twist it and look at it through our blurry vision, which needs to be corrected by the propositional revelation of God, as well as, by propositional, I don't mean just propositions, but also the testimony to the acts of God through redemptive history and so forth. Anyway, I think this has been a kind of an exciting section. I've been stimulated by it. I think it opens up continuing areas for further reflection and explication by the young Van Tilians. But I think we're getting right at the heart of the matter, and that is how it is that in the very act of subjectivity itself, God is there upholding the process. Let me add as a parenthesis here that we just happen to be in a perfect time of history to drive this point home, namely because of the rise of so-called artificial intelligence, or AI. So we have this viewpoint out there that computers are on the verge of becoming personalities, or persons even, with intelligence. And this is something that I think we can refute fairly easily. You know, if you think about what a computer is, most of them are von Neumann architecture, but the same point could be made for other architectures. But in the von Neumann architecture, you have a machine that calculates an address mathematically for which it's going to go out and fetch something from memory. And that word that it fetches from memory goes into a register, which then is combined with logic, which calculates a new address that it will go to and so forth. And then there might be another memory that it fetches data from, or the same memory, using the same methodology. And you're going through an algorithm to do calculations, essentially. And then not just calculations, but produce things that look kind of quasi-human. So for example, the very first program that every single C programmer in the world has ever written, because it's on page 1 of the standard book, is a little program that is called Hello World. And you run this program, and lo and behold, out prints the words Hello World on your computer screen. And then that shows that you've reached kind of the first little mini milestone in learning the C language. And, you could imagine a behaviorist saying, see, it's talking to you. It's saying hello world. And therefore it's a person. Empirically, this looks like a person. And of course, everybody on that example is going to say, yeah, right. I mean, you could have said Gabulu Shuvlu and just print out random characters. There's no soul there that's saying hello world. It's just fetching data and then sending it to a printer that responds to data stream by printing out certain letters that you've programmed in advance. So what makes the artificial intelligence seem a little bit plausible is that they've kind of learned how to interpret language and then convert a set of data into syntactically correct sentences and put it into a voice simulation machine that sounds like something is talking to you. But of course, that still is the same thing going on. You can look at those components and figure out how it does what it does, and you're not looking at the operation of a person. There's no ego there. It's just operations taking place, no matter how fast and how complicated they might seem to be. I mean, the proof of it at the end of the day, at an intuitive level, that you're not and never will be dealing with a person, is that no one would say that by unplugging the computer, or even unplugging it and then pulling chips out and throwing them away so it wouldn't work anymore, is murder. It's not murder, it's just a machine. And so we're kind of reaching a stage of civilization where, again, the ungodly are kind of going crazy because they want, by all means, for the image of God to not be something unique. And yet it's going to fail. Why does it fail? Well, our own personhood cannot be reduced to a computer running software. And the reason we can see that is because even Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, observed that the self can constantly negate any account that's given of itself. And so, like, suppose they reached a point where some guy thought that you could hook your brain up to a machine which would then interpret all the little jiggles and twitches to interpret what you're intending to do. And you can watch, and you can maybe even predict by using physics and predict that at 4 o'clock you're going to decide to go to Starbucks. Well, you should be able to then look through this microscope at your own brain doing this and then see that. But then at the moment of 4 o'clock, you say, well, no, I'm not going to go to Starbucks after all. I'm going to do something else. And no matter what the image would tell you, you can negate it. You can do something other than that. So there's this ego that keeps slipping away. It's like a lizard that you keep grabbing and it keeps slipping away, going one step back, constantly negating whatever proposal is made to reduce it to an operation. And I think that many people realize this, like even at the street level, guys you meet in the bar, all the way up to specialists in AI that haven't been corrupted by modernism, recognize what I'm saying is the case. But I think this can be driven home because even though we can see how it is that the ego of a person differs from any machine, no matter how complex you could make it, nevertheless, is this not a wondrous thing? Like, where does this come from? And here's where we can really drive the apologetic forward, that we know ourselves and we can see ourselves as our own object of its own subject because we see God who's revealing himself, who then reflects ourselves back to us as an image of ourselves and upholds this entire subjective process. So this would again be not only something that I hope those of you that are looking to apply Van Til could pick up on, but also, again, young Van Tillians or young students of apologetics looking for term paper topics or master's thesis topics, this would be a great one, would be to dig deeper into this whole question of artificial intelligence and then do this compare and contrast of how the biblical view of the ego almost emerges as a necessary concept in contrast to the pretensions of artificial intelligence. So that brings us through section 4.3. We'll continue with 4.4 next time. See you then.